Catherine of Valois. The queen left naked and unburied for 400 years. Catherine of Valois died on the 3rd of January, 1437. Her corpse would be a tourist attraction for centuries. She would be oddly disgraced even in death. On October 27, 1401, Catherine of Valois was born at the royal palace of the Hôtel Saint-Pol in Paris. One of 8 children born of the marriage was the Queen of England from 1420 until 1422. Her father was King Charles VI of France and his queen, Isabeau of Bavaria. Her first husband, Henry V, was King of England. She gave birth to his heir Henry VI of England. Catherine's marriage was a plan to eventually place Henry V on the throne of France, and put an end to what is now known as the 100 Years of War, but it was her union with her second husband which would create a new dynasty. Catherine and Henry were married at the Parish Church of St. John at Troyes Cathedral on the 2nd of June 1420. Catherine gave birth to a son named Henry on the 6th of December 1421 at Windsor. Her husband never saw their child because he fell ill and later died during the siege of Baux on the 31st of August 1422. After the death of her husband, her son Henry became the King of England and France as Henry VI. Catherine was still very young when her husband died. She had many suitors until she met Owen Tudor, as he's known today. He was a Welsh household official of the widowed queen and had been in the service of Henry's steward Sir Walter Hungerford. He was appointed keeper of Catherine's household or wardrobe. They fell in love and contracted a controversial marriage that changed the course of history. Although controversial, the marriage was recognized as legal and the children born to Catherine were considered legitimate. There is no known date of Catherine's marriage to Owen, but the couple had at least 6 children together. Their sons would create the line of Tudor kings that ruled England for nearly 150 years. But Catherine, the mother of that dynasty, would be oddly disgraced after her death. Catherine died on the 3rd of January 1437 in London. After childbirth, she was just 35 years old when she died. The cause of her death is uncertain, but it is known that she did not die as a result of childbirth. There are some records to indicate she'd had health issues that had troubled her for some time. The cause of her death could have been cancer. There is also the possibility she suffered from the metabolic disorder called porphyria, a disease that many English monarchs suffered from. And that is why she sought treatment or prayers at Bermondsey Abbey. Catherine was given a huge funeral deserving of a queen. Despite her scandalous remarriage to Owen Tudor, she was buried in a tomb in the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey. This tomb was destroyed when the chapel was torn down to make way for a new chapel commissioned by King Henry VII, Catherine's grandson, in 1508. Her coffin was open and on display after it was disinterred, and visitors were allowed to view it for hundreds of years. Following her death, the queen was embalmed by removing her internal organs to prevent decay. The cavity was stuffed with spices and herbs. The corpse was wrapped in cerecloth, a heavy cloth coated in wax, and encased in sheets of lead, then put into a wooden coffin. The organs that were extracted had been placed in huge jars or boxes and were sometimes buried in separate locations. Usually some of the organs of the deceased would be buried in the churches the funeral procession stopped at. For example, parts of Eleanor of Castile ended up in 3 different churches. This was a tradition at that time. Just at the top of her coffin was laid an effigy of the queen which showcased what she was wearing. Catherine's effigy was carved of wood, and still survives in Westminster Abbey up until now. It was painted in colors that were realistic, it has a long neck, and displays her as a charming woman with a willowy figure. It had a wig of human hair attached to its head. The painting shows that her eyes were blue-gray. The effigy now wears only its painted red shift. The coffin itself was swathed in cloth of gold, perched on top of a huge hearse. A few years later, on February 8, 1437, Catherine was given a second and last funeral service and finally laid to rest in an alabaster tomb in Westminster Abbey with her first beloved husband, Henry V. At this point her story should have ended, but that wasn't the case for the poor queen. Her son Henry VI wished to hold a more appropriate memorial for her, but he died before he could make a decision what to erect in her memory. What later happened was so disgusting and disrespectful to the queen. For most people, the story would end here, but not for poor Catherine. Her grandson, Henry VII, made a decision to demolish the old Lady Chapel where Catherine was buried in order to build a new one, but in the process Catherine's tomb was badly destroyed. Her body was unearthed as they were digging the new foundations of the chapel. At the time her coffin had been there for a few decades, it was found to be badly decayed, and so her remains were taken out of it, and apparently from the inner lead coffin as well. They were put in a wooden chest lined with flat sheets of lead cut from the old roof of the chapel. The chest lay on the floor near her husband's tomb, and there it would remain for a good 300 years, unburied, which for generations became a tourist attraction. Many people claimed that Henry VII ordered the tomb's deliberate destruction in order to have nothing to do with his ancestors. However, he clearly mentioned Catherine specifically in his will as someone he genuinely wanted to be buried with. Since people describe her bare skin with no clothing over it, it appears Catherine was buried naked in her shroud, and was displayed without its covering. It's said that the abbey tour guides made money off the poor dead queen. They charged a shilling or more for visitors to get a look at Catherine's remains, and her body was a popular tourist attraction for upwards of 300 years. Many concluded it was a punishment Catherine ended up like that because she chose to go against the wishes of Henry V, who didn't want his heir to be born at Windsor, because he heard a prophecy that a prince born at Windsor would be cursed and lose everything his father worked hard for. But Catherine didn't listen. Therefore she ended up giving birth to Henry VII at Windsor. It is believed that Catherine couldn't contain her fleshly lust for Owen Tudor, so Catherine may have been seen as an unsympathetic person who ended up as a morbid curiosity through her own bad behavior. Several writers have speculated that kissing Catherine's corpse had become something of a tradition, referenced by Shakespeare in the play with several kisses for the queen who had witchcraft in her lips. But it seems the mistreatment of her body escalated as the 18th century passed. In 1786, Richard Gough wrote that in recent years, the young scholars at Westminster had amused themselves with tearing it to pieces. When Gough himself saw it, he reported the condition of the body as being a shapeless mass of a whitish color. In 1788, the situation was rectified somewhat when Catherine's remains were put into the Villiers vault when it was opened to admit the recently deceased Countess of Buckingham. There it lay, undisturbed, for almost 100 years, and memory began to fade. Her location was half forgotten when Dean Stanley, who restored other monuments in the abbey, began to search for Catherine in the records. In December 1877, Lord Percy died and his family tomb was opened to put his body with Queen Victoria's permission. They broke through Percy's vault, which had a thin wall that separated his tomb and that of Catherine. The team found her remains on top of a pile of coffins, beneath the Countess's effigy. They tried to lift Catherine's coffin, but it stuck to the coffin below. After several attempts they managed to free and move it out of the vault. The humidity wasn't favorable. Within minutes the coffin had fallen into fragments. Unfortunately, several portions of Catherine's body were found to be missing and some of them were eaten away by the lime. The front of her skull was gone. Almost all her vertebrae and all her ribs were nowhere to be seen. One of her clavicles was gone and had been replaced with a pelvic bone. All her teeth were missing. But report shows that the bones were so fragile from the dampness that they powdered away when touched, like wet sand, but they hardened as they dried. They placed Catherine's remains into a new coffin, made of thick English oak. They put the pieces of the old chest inside the new one, along with an inscription plate explaining the journey her body had taken over the last 100 years. They finally built a new tomb beneath an altar slab sing grey marble, with a slab of slate inside on which the coffin would rest. After 400 years, Catherine got what she deserved in the first place, the tomb of a queen. It's disgusting how her remains were treated with so much disrespect. What's even more disgusting is that not even her family members made sure this woman had a proper burial. It's hard to understand how people could be so disrespectful to a dead body that has no power to defend itself.